London School of Architecture lecture Tectonics on building regulations and design guides. This follows on from the previous lecture on logistics, site constraints, construction management, and draws less so on the intuition that was discussed in that lecture, but more on the documents and research that build the foundations of your constraints for a brief. What has been done in the past in design guides, and what in terms of legislature, through the building regulations, the approved documents, is set out for you to design within as direct constraints. So this is going to touch on, first of all, building regulations and talk through those and the principles and how you should also look to question some of them and the process for that. And then we'll move into design guides and talk about the thesis and principles behind that. There'll be a series of examples of both. The design guides in more detail in this particular part. Both the DPD and ITT draw upon the building regulations and the design guides. The DPD obviously picks up on which building regulations are of particular interest to you, and your draft submissions will have started to allude to that, and probably in the process of you revising your drafts, you'll become clearer and more focus applied to that particular section of the building regulations. Your ITT will obviously have referenced the building regulation that you're interested in so much as your technical drawings will have to demonstrate an understanding of the constraints that the building regulations set up. The ITT will also draw upon your design guides. What is the subject which you're reviewing, and how are you technically demonstrating an understanding of what has been done before? Or are you producing a piece of R&D, research and design, a new thesis for that piece of ITT work? So in front of you now is a slide on building regulations, just 3 examples of them, E, B and M. And we're going to talk through what these are. All of you will be familiar with this in principle. They are the government's documents that set out how buildings must be constructed in the terms of material safety, fabric, and therefore how one goes about designing and producing the design information that will allow a constructor to build that, and what information you put in your drawings to make sure that you're achieving certain credentials relative to each subject. Be that, as you can see, Part E, passage of sound. So does a flat in a building resist sound coming from adjacent flats? Or in a fire situation, does a room contain a fire, and can you compartmentalize the other parts of the building to make sure you have safe egress and escape? Part M, for instance, picks up on access. Are buildings accessible for all? Can buildings be modified to make sure they can be accessible in the future should an occupant change their access capabilities? The building regulations break down information into quite clear diagrammatic and text form. They're advisory documents, and in some instances there'll be occasions where one can question this and one can come to another agreement. Now, this is a process where in England you can appoint an approved inspector. It's different in Scotland. That approved inspector doesn't exist. An approved inspector is somebody who can sign off building regulations as opposed to the local authority. That process with the approved inspector has to happen before the project gets to the point where you're retrospectively doing anything. So you can't have done the works, or you can't have commenced the works to a point where the local authority would automatically be appointed. That's quite a complicated scenario, but it's very orthodox. And in typical situations, large projects, an approved inspector would be appointed to work with the design team to develop a design that's in accordance with the regulations. And where there are scenarios because of existing constraints, for instance, an existing building that might be listed, some building regulations have to be questioned, and other factors need to be considered to deal with that. It might be a management situation that resolves that particular regulation. Simply because on a Grade 1 listed building, one might not be able to implement the most up-to-date building regulation. That could be to do with conservation, historicism, or simply the pure functioning capability of the construction of that building. So here are some examples of how one would deal with and diagram out what you're trying to achieve. How are you explaining to somebody in very simple terms what you're wanting to achieve in a principle. The building regulations are no different. They're explaining a principle. They're demonstrating on the generic what one has to then reapply and understand to the specific. The building regulations can't cover every single specific instance, and this feeds directly into the design guidelines. Design guidelines are guidelines, and they can't pick up on every specific. And so with the building regulations as an architect, you're being asked to understand the principle, the design principle of what the regulation is setting out, and then reapply that and apply and understand that constraint to how you're designing on the specific. So how is you, as an architect, going to reapply this, or possibly even rewrite, in some instances, a building regulation that is attuned to your thesis? Is your thesis trying to ask questions which are new? Whereas, in some instances, it's so generic and simple and anthropometric. This is an obvious diagram of a handrail, but one wouldn't want necessarily to always have a face-planted, wall-mounted handrail with a generic 32mm to 50mm diameter handing bar. So how does one reorganize this? So for instance, at a museum or a gallery, one could take a very different effect in stone. How can one integrate this into a residential situation? So these are the guidelines which, in the generic, you're looking to define back into the specific. So as the design principle, what's important to you? How do you specifically define what regulation is critical to your design thinking, and then re-understand what's being asked of your design? And in asking of your design through this constraint, how you can design around it. Not ignore it, not remove it. You have to comply. But you have to also be able to understand what you can do to do that. So how do then building regulations pick up and move into design guides? And I'll come back to some of the building regulations later as we look through these. BCO is a large document, British Council for Offices. They produce a document called the Guide to Specification. It's a document which lays out all of the criteria for specifying offices, commercial buildings. Everything from floor plate guidance, area schedules, area intensity, and for a large real estate investment trust, a developer, a commercial developer, they'll be deferring to this, as will the agents, so Savills or CBRE. So a lessee, a buyer, somebody who's wanting to come in and be the tenant of a property will want to understand at a BCO level what the criteria is. And that's an apples for apples piece of design guidance. It's to make sure that when they're looking to lease and to take up that lease, they can say from one project in Canary Wharf, it has X BCO criteria, to one project in the City of London has another, or for instance in NoHo, Soho, the city. So the BCO is a way of providing a level playing field. And if you are designing commercial building or with office, that's critical. It's critical for you to be able to understand that. And then also call it into question in some instances. What parts need to be updated? Or is your attitude towards your thesis a new way of working? Are you applying an attitude to your new way of working for commercial office spaces that addresses this in a very different way? Maybe there isn't a section in the BCO which can apples for apples assess your criteria. There's then the sort of graphic heavy and language diagrams, which you're probably familiar in terms of the pictogram and very architectural and seductive books that are published that pick up on the way in which one must communicate clearly. And that necessity to be erudite is one of the most important parts of design guidelines, and is important in your design principles document and your ITT, well, across all of your work. How clear can you be with what you're trying to explain, but then also how iconic can you be? And what are those iconic routes or diagrams for your work that can pick up on parts that can be understood? Is there a handrail that is synonymous with you as an architect in terms of your language? Is your design style synonymous in so much as your design principles document clearly lays out it as a language? And maybe your ITT needs to lay out that in order to define your language as a brand, there are certain things which you're asking a constructor to make sure they can do. So how does branding, how do you understand a branding document? A document that lays out fundamentals and generics that have to be interpreted by many people in many more years to come and across many scenarios. The National Rail Alphabet is a very good example. How does this get reused? How does this type font get set and applied for many, many, many scenarios, but also in terms of scale and size and direction? Comprehension. Is what you're trying to do comprehensible? Can it be comprehended by a larger pan audience? So how specific are you becoming from the generic and the design guide picking up on a topic? How specific can you make sure that your design work is, and therefore apply that back to some of our early conversations about the currency of your work? Is it important to you that you're not specific and that this is an open source piece of architecture? Maybe that is important. Maybe actually that is specific and that is the currency of your work. So be clear to define how the typography, the language of what you're setting out as your design has clarity in the design principles document, but then it's also achievable in the ITT. Are you doing something which has the capability of being refined? How simple are you working? And in working simply, how can you make sure that pieces of your work are identifiable? You may have noticed recently that Bjarke Ingels has come out again to reinforce his position on being proud that none of his projects are the same or have similarity, in so much as the similarities that they're all different and there isn't a tying language between them. Well, perhaps that is in its own way the identifiable piece of design language of BIG. But what is yours? How do you set your position? Architects are traditionally known for having a language. It is understood that in buying a brand, be that in couture, high design, that there is a zeitgeist and a fashion, and then there's also the other end of timeless work that picks up on many other nuances. So what are design guides and how do they sort of breadth? So how do they span? What is their breadth? This is an example that we'll go into more detail in a moment. This is a provincial design guide for understanding how one should model the massing and typology of a suburban vernacular, a slightly historic suburban vernacular in Essex. And it sets out those sort of rules. It has a great peculiarity. It's saying, here's what you can do. The Housing Design Guide Handbook, many of you will be very aware of that from Levitt Bernstein. All sorts of rules, a compendium of information on how to design, but it's a reference document. It's a fact. This is working on the basis of what is good and bad, what has been achieved before. Do not set yourself up with the presumption that you're going to invent a new wheel. Make sure that you understand those wheels that have been invented before you. The Mayor of London sets out the London Plan. That's very different from the Levitt Bernstein Housing Design Handbook. The London Plan starts to put things into legislature at a regional level that local authorities at a local level have to pick up on and demonstrate their capability to deliver under. How does your project, from the point of view of both specific site language and then also contextual wider planning, pick up and understand that national NPPF, regional London Plan, and local authority legislature, the policy? How are you working within that guidance? How within the design guidance of what you should do based on history and precedent, currently do based on policy, and have to do based on building regulations? Those three critical scales to understand and then reinterpret across the DPT and the ITT. Everyone's familiar with the metric handbook. So how are you applying all of those parts before back into criteria which we understand as the most basic, these anthropomorphic diagrams that one understands in first year, and going back to that handrail in the building regulations, you should start to ask questions about, should the desk be that height? Well, there isn't necessarily a building regulation for desks, but there is in Part M for accessible points where you buy tickets at, for instance, a museum or a theatre. But how do you Or what is the composite diagram design that combines the regulation for ticket height with a piece of work, a piece of product industrial design for that ticket bench that isn't as generic as the regulation? How do you pick up on that at the Natural History Museum or the V&A or at the Tate Modern or the Pompidou? Many different design styles and languages, which your design principles document will set out as an attitude, and your ITT might pick up as a way of building. It's then also broken down into the metric handbook typologies. So these adjacency diagrams that start to explain the principle of your thesis. This is a prison, a holding cell, incredibly complex sort of, let's call it air side and land side, the private part, the public part, the safe part, the dangerous part. This is still guidance. This isn't regulation. But beneath that regulation of the building regulation and guidance, there are then standards. So you have British standards, BSs, and EN standards, European national standards. So how are you starting to construct your work whilst considering also those standards that one has to comply to? That's another level of complexity relative to the typology of your thesis. If you are doing something like a creche or a learning centre, there are British standards to the way in which you have to set out things and apply those rules. How do you diagram between the pure diagram, the relationship diagram, that organogram of zoning, and then dolly between back to the architectural plan? How are you redefining or possibly rewriting the relationship zoning diagram? Are you, again, generating a thesis for a commercial office space that maybe has a very different set of relationships and zoning diagrams? If we look at WeWork or the collective are looking at a very different attitude towards housing, shared space, very small private space, large public space. WeWork have developed an attitude towards existing buildings, and again, that shared occupancy. Where is privacy and where are those lines drawn? Where are our shared infrastructure? And then it goes out, and you'll be familiar with the examples it sets out as what has been done before. How do we understand what you're trying to do and the legitimacy of it based on what has been done before? Are you aware of what's been done before? Are you aware of its success and failings? How clear are you on its previous critique? How can you pick up those topics? This is just looking at a library for you as a very good example that has fundamentally scientific processes similar to a hospital or a prison, in so much as there are clear divisions between two types of information, and now even more so with digital information. The retrieval of that information, the safeguarding of that information, the conservation of that information, the retraction of that information, the learning from it, the study of it. How does that organogram and diagram of zoning then become interpreted back into the architectural plan? But how does that architectural plan have then the basis of design guides for accessibility, for instance, or the use or type of information, and then be underwritten by building regulations? How are you making sure that the organogram and zoning rules that you're being guided by for the design of your typology, the design guide of a library, is then being reapplied to your design style, your architectural language? And how does that sit within building regulations? How do you make sure that you are complying with those regulations, but you have the tenacity and capability of complying to those regulations with the mindset of being able to reinterpret them into your design language? And that's the critical moments of your DPD and your ITT. Not dissimilar from logistics on site and being able to see things intuitively. How can you see through design guidelines and building regulations to understand what those constraints are that provide you with a design brief that allow you to reapply that back into the constraints and rules that you set yourself as a designer? Are you driven by rules of the grid? Are you driven by rules of other associations or classicism as a particular style that you want to make sure is then driven in the trabeated architecture of a facade. How are you able to apply the design language rules of that trabeated facade because you want a classical appearance through your library back in through Part L of the building regulations to make sure you have a thermal gap between those facade parts and internal parts, and then moreover those internal parts that have to house conservation collections that are totally separate, or such invaluable collections that must be secure and avoid any risk of theft. So these many levels and separations are parts which are critical to then lay out and explain as principles that are important to you. We just touched upon that national level. The NPPF is the piece of policy that picks this up together. And we'll touch on that at another point. But that then fits into this County of London plan, so the Goldfinger example. And these last two parts, the NPPF and the County of London plan, are ones which we'll then touch on in the next lecture. We'll now go back and look at some of the design guides specifically. So building regulations. Just going to look at one, Part B, partially because Generic in the recent revision is looking to revise Part B, fire, due to the horrific incidences of Grenfell and some of the difficulties in its interpretation. And when we talked about interpretation and the role of the architect, the role of the client, the role of the approved inspector, fire is possibly one of the most important to get right, obviously, but also to understand in your interpretation. Are you interpreting something that has a life safety risk? In some instances, it won't have a life safety risk. The U value, thermal performance, won't necessarily have a life safety risk. Fire does, access does. And therefore, how are you as the architect making sure that you're understanding the approved document and interpreting it from the generic to the specific? So if we go down into means to escape from flats, and the one thing I just want to touch on here is the room-in-room scenario. So how are you making sure in a room-in-room scenario, let me explain that. An ensuite is a room in a room, and to escape from that bedroom, you leave the bedroom, you go into the corridor. The corridor is a fireproof area, a different enclosure it's called, but the room-in-room is the ensuite. It's a room within the bedroom. How do you escape from the ensuite to the corridor if the bedroom's on fire? Now that is something that you have to design through, and the language of that definition explains parts of it to do with the likely flammability of a bathroom, an ensuite, but then also your familiarity with your own bedroom. And then also applies the risk of, if there were to be a fire, it's likely that you're only going to be in your bedroom when you're asleep, or more likely that most of the time you're in your bedroom, you're asleep, and that therefore when you wake up, you might be in a state of slumber, so you're at more risk. So these are factors that are taking on a lot of hyperbole or a lot of presumption, but require you to then redefine how you're applying a design interest or a client brief for wanting something back through the building regulations to understand how to do it. And so this starts to set up the examples of that. And another example, for instance, is the scenario of a kitchen within a living room, the open plan scenarios, the enclosures of staircases. So for me, in terms of your DPD, it's the selection of part of your project's relevant building regulations, which you've now done in the provision of your drafts, and then particularly finding a part which is of interest and saying, here is how I've mitigated this constraint or risk. I showed you a slide earlier of the National Rail branding and lettering guidance, the typography rules. Station design principles for network rail. You're probably thinking, wow, amazingly interesting document this. Quite a short document. It's 43 pages. But it's a critical document. You can see here at the back. You've then got all of the guidance notes. And that's the breadth and importance of this sort of document. Is then when you understand those, which one isn't ever really expected to fully understand, one then can understand the component principles of customer needs. So going back in terms of your client briefing, if the thesis or the principle of your approach is to present a client briefing and how you've reinterpreted that client briefing through into a thesis and then a design attitude and a piece of architecture, how are you making sure the constraints of that likely typology, be it the library or the station or the housing authority, are picked up? So what are those pieces of design guidance that are critical for you? So we'll just talk you through this one again. So at the back, appendix, applicable legislation, standards and guidance. Really important to get that in there. Bulk of it, background, okay, fine. Design policy and principles. This is the critical part. Safety and security by design. Inclusiveness, accessibility. Capacity for future proofing. Whole life cost and operation, system approach. Urban integration, heritage, stakeholder interface. 26, that's the one I want to go to. Here we go. Urban integration, heritage, stakeholder interface. This is the network rail document design guidance for integrating your station from a heritage point of view and the stakeholder interface. It's terrible. So we're now into the end of that part, and you've gone through 4 summarized images. So when I say terrible, how are you expected as a architect, albeit this is a summarized document and you're being directed also to design guidance at the back, to pick up on the massive topic of a high likelihood that your piece of new infrastructure will be integrated into an existing city, and therefore in that integration understand its context, its historical existing buildings most likely, but then also the multitude of stakeholders. My question and direction to you in looking at design guidance is to provoke the question back and say, there are holes in design guidance that I've been reviewing. The design guidance should be greater in this particular area. If you're doing a station, I'd ask you to pick up on this particular part. It is thin, so standardized approach. There are clear efficiencies, advantages to be gained from standardization in design, procurement and maintenance of station properties. Very simple language, very simple sentences. There's nothing in depth here that picks up on it. So, in terms of that major section, let's go back up to here. Urban integration, heritage and stakeholder interface. 1 page, 26 to 27. 1 page. Not enough. So I'd ask you, what would you do to rewrite it? Essex Architectural Design Guide. It's a cracker. I showed you a slide just earlier in the slideshow. So my interest in this one is it's a very good design guide. Not a lot of local authorities, the wider counties, pick up on such clear guidance. Now, whether one agrees with the guidance or not is separate in this particular example, but it's important that this local authority, this county, has picked up on it and set out a direction for how one achieves a planning direction. So you're being guided in terms of the vernacular of Essex of what you can do. It's saying, here's how you apply, incorrectly apply dormers, and here's how you correctly apply dormers. Well, arguably, I think there are plenty of examples of historic vernacular that applies dormers in this scenario. So again, how are you making sure that there's a capability to argue for the specific amongst the generic. Argue for the specific amongst the generic, be it integrating a major piece of infrastructure like a station into the city in its historic context, or that handrail because you know that it's better to do it one way, and you can demonstrate a compliance to a British standard for its grip, or the building regulation for its height and its size. But for you as the architect to demonstrate the efficacy of your work and your direction that accommodates those constraints, that understands them. So there are scenarios here where when we scroll forward and you have your semi-detached with your sort of clinker board and garage, you then start to pick up on a little bit more specific work. And here we go. So appropriate detailing for materials used. This is fantastic if you're wanting to apply a particular line, but at least it's giving you a direction. So how are you in your design principles document providing that direction for a contractor or for anyone else to reinterpret what you're trying to do? How are you setting out what you're doing? So appropriate detailing materials used. How does it pick up and summarize something like a Pevsner attitude to that county into 4 diagrams of what's correct and incorrect? Blockwork detailed as neither one nor the other. Well, insomuch as that is then one. So, how are you placing yourselves with your argument to make sure that the reverse engineering of your intent is then understood? And what do I mean by that? Once you've gone through the process of interpreting the regulations, the guidance, the standards, and derived your piece of architectural work, that's then going to be interpreted by those other people. And last week we talked about some of those other people, the constructors, the client, those people in years to come who will look at it and judge its timelessness or not. They'll reverse engineer and try and understand some of your intent, or they may not, they may take it at face value. So in this example, this has been written by that local authority, that county's design officer, and they've started to make some educated academic directions in terms of architectural language and a conservation and historicist approach to that vernacular. In so much as in 50, 60, 70 years, one could equally argue that Wimpey Homes or Barrett Homes has become that vernacular. So how are you setting yourself up to forecast what the reverse engineering of your intent is? Is your intent clear enough? Have you summarized your brand and simplified what you're doing to demonstrate your intent? Or is it being misinterpreted and falls into the incorrect block of block work detailed as neither one nor the other? Are your architectural intentions neither one nor the other, or are they clear? Is there a tectonic attitude to your moves? Go back out and look at this. So the Essex Design Guide, this is included in the document folders and you'll be able to review it. For the sake of a design guide, it's actually quite an interesting one to just sort of scroll through and see how myopic and risky one could fall into. Industrial Intensification Primer, Mayor of London. So, not national, not local, regional. Industrial Intensification Primer. So, focused on, to a certain extent, beds and sheds, a lot of what Mark Brealey did in Southwark, and making sure that we don't lose our industrial capability as a city. Really good document. So here's a piece of design guidance to say, how do we make sure that we keep makers at a small level, but then also at a very, very large level. Later in the document, we go to here we are. Operational intensification. So how can we have multitude of operations in the same place? but then also deal with site intensification in terms of scale. So going from that small scale here through to some of the larger big sheds you see. And how can we reappropriate those sheds to do multiple activities? This is a really clear document that sets out some rules and some attitudes towards the regional authority's direction. Now, what's really important here is it's setting out them as case studies, but they're also international case studies. So, how are you presenting your attitude within the obvious opportunity and attraction of international case studies, but then referring that back to the context of your locality? And we've touched upon how we use the planning system to understand some of that context, but also how are you using some of those design guides like the Goldfinger final slide to understand the capability of the local area for you specifically. The precedents that you're applying from a Swiss Valley need to get reinterpreted and recycled back through into pieces of design guidance for you within the contextual position of your site within London. So why is this document important for me? It's a regional document, it's a London document that places a counterpoint between international examples of great success and learning from others and other ways of doing things and being provocative, but then also reapplies it to local scenarios as well. And it's that balance which is critical. Understanding how things can change by clear alternative precedents, but then also applying that specifically to the context that you're interested in. This document's also available in our share folder. I'm just going to find Carl Turner's building around the corner from the studio. It's a good example of multiple intensification. Where are we? Here we are. Adder Street. His studio's up here somewhere. Okay. London Housing Design Guide Interim Edition, and then also the SPG for the Supplementary Planning Guidance. So these two documents, which I won't go through into full detail of because they're massive, pick up on everything to do with housing at that regional level. Okay, and it's not expected that local authorities deviate from this. They generally refer straight back to it. They'll pick up on, from a local level, the design language guidance and attitude towards how one has a planning position within a local authority, but they refer back to the regional attitude of what's once being tried to achieve by the mayor. So those two documents are important to obviously review if you're doing housing, but also please review the interim one specifically, because it understands the urgency of having to do a document, and the section I'd like you to look at is, or all of you to review. There we are. From street to front door. So there's a really nice piece of written text here, and this is, in my mind, applicable to housing or any building, and is part of this topic which we discussed last week of the interface of your building and the city and the street. What are you doing, or how are you making sure that you can achieve that opportunity of building to the perimeter, or being clear that you don't need to because you're doing something else? So from the street to the front door, what's that first relationship with that door handle? So section 3, the thresholds, front doors, common areas and walkways of a building can transform the perceived value of a home, let's just call that, of a building, and help people feel proud of where they live, we could say work. The central aim of this guide is to promote common areas that are well designed. Well, common areas, communal parts, streets. So there's a lovely piece of text here that I think will just focus you all on how London sort of sets itself out. Again, a document that's been in part produced by Design for London and those at the GLA. Two final documents, Streetscape Guidance and SUDS. These are two far more technical documents than some of the sort of subjective attitudes of the interim guide and then the specifics and quantities of the Supplementary Planning Guidance, the SPG. The Streetscape Guidance and SUDS are huge, 387 pages or 337 pages, 160 pages. So this picks up on all sorts of massive pieces of design, feature and example. Okay, way too much detail to expect from you. But what I'd like to understand from you is, how are you interfacing your building with the city? Is that important to you? In your design principles document, how are you setting out the relationship of your building with its landscape? And I think that all of you should touch on that in part. Why? Because I think that in your ITTs, given that all of you will be starting to explain your structure, you have an interface with the ground at some point. And therefore, what is that tectonic relationship? And when I alluded to it earlier, talking about libraries and a classicism or a trabeated attitude, what is the connection between that facade and its interior use and the city itself? How are you interfacing those relationships in terms of the streetscape, the city? Because ultimately, the lion's share of what you are particularly interested in, or the majority of you are particularly interested in, is your design language, the architectural language and appearance of your facade. It's the challenge that a lot of you come to head with at this point in the year. You're starting to visualize your projects. Well, therefore, even more so, what is that streetscape and townscape attitude? What is affecting and directing your architectural language? How is that tectonic being related into it? How are you interfacing all of those constraints of ability to build and the logistics through to the standards and guidance that set up the rules of how you do that? How are you in control of this? And so Streetscape Guidance document from the Mayor of London is a starting point, but it's very quantitative driven. It's very objective. It doesn't have some of the sweeter direction and talking of the interim housing design guide. But what it does have is planning for the future. Here we are, 10. Can't find it. Planning for the future is the one part which is worth reading. SUDS. Okay, what are SUDS? Sewage. I'm not going to talk about this really at all, other than to say, similar to some of the previous questions, how are you connecting your building? So here's the London context. This chapter explains some of the conditions particular to London, although may also be found in other metropolitan areas. Some are unique, others less so, but all will influence the integration of SUDS into the public realm. London is by far the UK's biggest metropolitan region, etc., etc., etc. But when you then jump a couple of paragraphs, the Thames Tideway Tunnel is addressing some of these issues at a strategic level, particularly in relation to events of intense rainfall. Nevertheless, many local SUDS interventions are needed to manage the progress effectively. Nevertheless, many local SUDS interventions are needed to manage the process effectively. I'm just using one example, and I've used it last week as well, in terms of connection to mains utilities. How are you making sure that your project as a building works? Some of your projects are vast, they're huge. How are you making sure that you have the capacity for a 50-story lift or 2,000 homes? Do you understand the logistics in order to achieve what you're setting out as a building? Are required statutory logistics by undertakers to connect to your building? I'm not expecting huge detail or explanation on that, but I want to understand that you understand the implications of building at scale within a city that's already strained under the scale of its development so far. So again, this document's in the folder. Have a quick skim, 5 minutes, and just pick up on a couple of parts. You can dip in and find a couple of bits. Nothing too specific, but you'll start to understand the scale of what you're intervening with. So some case studies in there which are worth looking at. But the super sewer section is probably the most useful. Okay, so where are we? Well, summarising back building regulations and design guides, and how do they fit into the constraints of legislation and direction? How do you implement them through local authorities or improved inspectors? How do you understand standards, British standards or EN codes? How do you mesh all those together in terms of that gearbox of constraints that mean you're not applying them directly, you're interpreting what they're setting out to achieve, making sure that that interpretation still complies, but still sets out a clear design language for you. So the tectonic, the direction of what you're intending, has clarity and can be easily understood by anyone else. Thank you very much. That's the lecture.